1913, a man sat alone in a room in Zurich and did something no respected doctor was supposed to do. He closed his eyes, picked up a pen, and let his own mind speak without controlling it. What came out terrified him. Visions of blood flooding Europe, voices that were not his own. A descent so severe that for the next 6 years, he later admitted he feared he was going insane. His name was Carl Jung, and the thing he discovered in that room would become one of the most disturbing warnings ever issued about the human mind. Not a warning about the mentally ill, a warning about the people we consider completely normal. The successful ones, the composed ones, the ones who never seem to break. Jung said the most dangerous person in any room is not the one who has confronted their darkness. It is the one who insists they don't have any. Here's the unsettling part. You have met this person. You may have worked for them. You may have loved them. You may, if you're honest with yourself for the next 20 minutes, recognize pieces of them in the mirror. Jung called it one of the great blind spots of civilized life, and almost a century later, neuroscience is proving he was right in ways he could never have measured. So what exactly did he see? What happens inside a person who refuses to look inward? And why did Jung believe that this refusal, more than any addiction, any trauma, any diagnosis, was the single most corrosive force in human relationships? Stay with this, because by the end, you will never look at a perfectly fine person the same way again. What do you do with the parts of yourself you refuse to look at? Jung had a simple, almost cruel answer. They don't disappear. They go underground and they run your life from the basement. He called this hidden territory the shadow, and it holds everything a person has decided is unacceptable about themselves. Rage they were taught to swallow, jealousy they were shamed for, selfishness, weakness, desire, cruelty. Every trait that once earned punishment or rejection gets exiled into darkness. And the exile isn't gentle, it's total. The person doesn't just hide these traits from others, they hide them from themselves. Here's where it gets strange. Jung didn't believe the shadow was evil. He believed it was simply unlived life, energy with nowhere to go. And energy, as any physicist will tell you, does not vanish, it transforms. So where does a person's unacknowledged rage go if they insist they are never angry? Where does buried envy go if someone insists they never compare themselves to anyone? It doesn't evaporate, it leaks into passive aggression, into sudden explosions that seem to come from nowhere, into a strange compulsion to criticize in others the exact thing they cannot admit in themselves. Jung had a phrase for this that should make you deeply uncomfortable. He said that everything we cannot tolerate about ourselves and other people teaches us to understand ourselves. Read that again slowly. The coworker who infuriates you with their arrogance. The relative whose selfishness makes your blood boil. Jung's claim is that the intensity of that reaction is a signal, not just about them, but about a disowned piece of you. Not always, but far more often than anyone wants to admit. This is the part that made Jung so controversial in his own era. He wasn't just describing criminals or the mentally unstable. He was describing the most respectable people in the room. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the shadow hides in the most composed, high-functioning people among us, how would you ever know it was there? Jung gave this second mechanism a name almost everyone has heard, but almost no one understands correctly: the persona. The persona is not a lie exactly. It's closer to a costume, one built from childhood onward, piece by piece, out of what a person's family rewarded, what their culture praised, what kept them safe from ridicule or abandonment. The dutiful daughter, the tough older brother, the class clown who learned that being funny was safer than being honest. Jung believed everyone needs a persona to function in society. The danger isn't wearing the mask. The danger is forgetting you put it on. Think about what that requires over decades. A child who learns that showing sadness leads to punishment will build an armor of cheerfulness so convincing that eventually, even they can't find the seam where the mask ends and the self begins. A man raised to believe emotion is weakness will construct a persona of total control. And here's the twist. He will believe it, not perform it. Believe it. He will tell you with complete sincerity that he simply doesn't get anxious, doesn't get scared, doesn't need anyone. And in a strange, tragic way, he'll be telling the truth as he experiences it, because the part of him that does feel those things has been sealed away so long, he no longer has access to it. This is where Jung's warning sharpens into something almost frightening. A person fully identified with their persona doesn't feel like they're hiding anything, which means they have zero motivation to look deeper. Why would you excavate a basement you don't believe exists? This is a person who can sit across from you at dinner, tell you they've never struggled with anything real, and mean it completely, while the people closest to them quietly absorb the fallout of emotions that never found another exit. And this raises the question that should be sitting in your chest right now. If someone doesn't know their own mask is a mask, who pays the price for the difference? Jung didn't leave this as an abstract theory. He watched it destroy marriages, friendships, and entire families. And he documented a pattern that therapists still see in consulting rooms today. Picture a household where one parent is, by all outward appearances, endlessly patient, never raises their voice, never seems to lose control. Friends describe them as a rock, but their child grows up walking on eggshells, flinching at moods that never announce themselves in words, but somehow fill an entire room. Why? Because unexpressed anger doesn't stay contained. It seeps into tone, into silence, into a coldness that has no clear cause and therefore no clear resolution. The child learns to read a parent's unspoken emotional weather because the spoken version never exists. That child often grows into an adult who is hyper-attuned to other people's feelings and strangely disconnected from their own, because they spent their formative years managing someone else's shadow instead of learning to face their own. Jung believed this transfer happens constantly and invisibly. The parts of ourselves we refuse to own don't stay locked inside us. They get projected outward onto the people who are too close, too dependent, or too loving to fight back. A partner who cannot tolerate feeling inadequate may spend years subtly undermining their spouse's confidence, entirely convinced they are simply being honest or helpful. A boss who cannot face their own insecurity may create a workplace where everyone else feels perpetually not good enough, while insisting they run a supportive team. Ask the people who work under them. The story will not match. This is the mechanism Jung considered more dangerous than open cruelty. Open cruelty can be named, confronted, escaped, unowned, shadow material, disguised as virtue is nearly impossible to fight, because the person causing the damage genuinely believes they are the reasonable one. How do you argue with someone who is certain they have nothing to argue with? And that certainty, Jung warned, is the most dangerous psychological state a human being can occupy. For decades, Jung's ideas lived mostly in clinical rooms and philosophy departments. Then, modern psychology started finding evidence that the blind spot he described is not just a poetic metaphor, it is measurable. Researchers studying what's now called the bias blind spot have found something remarkable. People are highly skilled at spotting cognitive and emotional distortions in others, while remaining almost completely unable to detect the same distortions in themselves, even when explicitly asked to look. It isn't a lack of intelligence. Some of the sharpest, most self-assured people show the strongest version of this blind spot because confidence in their own self-awareness becomes its own kind of armor. The smarter someone believes they are at reading themselves, the less likely they are to question the story they've already settled on. There's a related and even more unsettling finding in emotional regulation research. People who report the lowest levels of anger or negative emotion on questionnaires sometimes show the highest physiological stress markers when their bodies are actually measured. Elevated heart rate, elevated cortisol. Their nervous system is fighting a war their conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. In other words, the calm on the surface can be a performance the body never agreed to. This is precisely what Jung was pointing at nearly 100 years before we had the instruments to prove it. The unconscious does not negotiate with denial. It simply routes around it, into the body, into relationships, into behavior the person swears isn't really them. There's a third finding worth sitting with. Studies on emotional suppression consistently show that the effort to appear unaffected doesn't just fail to erase the underlying feeling, it costs the brain measurable resources. Suppression activates the same regions involved in effortful self-control, draining the exact mental fuel a person needs for patience, decision-making, and genuine connection. Which means the calmest person in the room may, biologically, be working the hardest. Not because they're weak, because they're spending enormous energy maintaining a story their nervous system never agreed to. So here's the uncomfortable question this raises for you personally. Not for your difficult coworker, not for your emotionally unavailable parent, for you. What if the trait you're most certain you don't have is exactly the one worth examining first? If facing the shadow could prevent all this damage, why doesn't everyone just do it? Because it's terrifying, and Jung never pretended otherwise. He described the encounter with your own shadow as a genuine moral crisis, not a nice self-help exercise. A confrontation with the possibility that you are capable of pettiness, cruelty, cowardice, and desire you've spent your whole life believing belonged only to worse people than you. Most human beings build their entire identity on being the good one, the reasonable one, the one who would never. Jung's insight strips that comfort away. He argued that real moral courage isn't found in people who have no darkness. It's found in people who have looked directly at their darkness and chosen, consciously, not to act on the worst of it. That choice means nothing if you've never admitted that darkness exists in the first place. There's a reason this is so hard. And it isn't weakness. It's architecture. The brain's threat detection system doesn't distinguish neatly between a physical danger and a threat to your self-image. Confronting a belief like maybe I am the difficult one in this relationship can trigger something close to the same defensive cascade as confronting a predator. Denial, in that light, isn't laziness. It's a survival mechanism doing exactly what it evolved to do, protecting a fragile sense of self from information that feels like an attack. The tragedy is that the mechanism built to protect us in moments of physical danger is the same one that keeps us blind to the psychological patterns quietly ruining our closest relationships. And this is where Jung's warning takes its final, sharpest turn. Because everything so far has been building toward a reversal you probably didn't see coming. Here is what almost no one discusses when they talk about the shadow, and it changes everything you've heard so far. Jung didn't only warn about the dark material people refuse to face. He warned just as urgently about something stranger, the disowned light. Not everything we bury is ugly. Sometimes we exile our own greatness, our own ambition, our own capacity for joy, because somewhere early on, those qualities were also punished. A child who is told, directly or through cold silence, that shining too brightly makes others uncomfortable will learn to shrink just as thoroughly as a child taught to suppress anger. That person grows up capable, talented, quietly brilliant, and utterly convinced that ordinary is all they're allowed to be. Jung called this the golden shadow, and it is, in many ways, more tragic than the dark one, because the world doesn't just lose a person's cruelty when it's suppressed, it loses their gift. Think about how this reframes everything discussed so far. The people who irritate you aren't the only mirror. So are the people you envy. Jung believed that intense, uncomfortable admiration, the kind that borders on resentment, is often a signal of your own unclaimed potential staring back at you through someone else's success. You don't just project your rage onto villains. You project your unlived greatness onto heroes, then convince yourself you could never be one. This is the twist. The warning was never only about people who deny their darkness. It's about anyone who has decided, consciously or not, that some entire portion of themselves is off limits, whether that portion is shameful or radiant. Wholeness in Jung's framework isn't about becoming good. It's about becoming complete. And completeness requires reclaiming both the parts you're afraid of and the parts you were told to make yourself small for. So what does facing yourself actually look like in practice without turning your life into an endless therapy session? Start with irritation, because it's the cheapest and most honest data you have. The next time someone's behavior gets under your skin in a way that feels disproportionate to the actual offense, pause before reacting and ask one blunt question. Where in my own life do I do a smaller version of this exact thing? Not always. Not every irritation is a mirror. But when the reaction feels bigger than the moment deserves, that gap is worth investigating. Next, get specific about your persona. Write down honestly the 3 traits you are most certain describe you, and then ask what would happen, who would be disappointed if you turned out to be the opposite. If you've built an identity as the strong one, ask what you'd lose by admitting exhaustion. If you've built an identity as the nice one, ask what anger you might be sitting on that never gets named. This isn't about tearing the persona down. Jung never asked anyone to abandon their mask entirely. He asked them to stop mistaking it for their whole face. Then, do the harder version of this exercise with admiration instead of irritation. Make a short list of people you quietly envy, and be brutally honest about what specifically you envy in them. That list is often a more accurate map of your buried potential than any goal-setting exercise you've ever done, because envy points at what you've already decided isn't allowed to be yours. Finally, build one relationship in your life, even just one, where you practice saying the true thing instead of the acceptable thing. Not cruelly, not carelessly, but honestly. Jung believed that shadow work done entirely alone tends to collapse into self-obsession. It needs a witness, someone safe enough to hear the parts of you that don't fit the mask, and steady enough not to flinch. None of this is comfortable. It was never supposed to be. But the alternative, Jung warned, is a life spent unconsciously handing your unexamined self to the people closest to you. One small projection, one unexplained mood, one mysterious resentment at a time. There's a version of you that only exists in the dark, in the parts of your personality you've never had the courage to turn around and look at directly. Jung's real warning was never about villains or monsters. It was about the ordinary, decent, well-liked people, the ones who seem so sure of who they are, who never once ask what they might be hiding, even from themselves. He believed the people who do the most damage in this world are rarely the ones wrestling visibly with their darkness. They're the ones who have convinced everyone, including themselves, that they don't have any. So here's the only question that actually matters after everything you've just heard. Not who in your life fits this description. You already know who. The real question is whether you're willing to ask it about yourself tonight, in the quiet, when no one else is watching and there's no persona left to perform for. If this made you see someone in your life differently, or maybe see yourself a little differently, that's exactly what Jung would have wanted. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the minds of Jung, Nietzsche, and the thinkers who understood the human psyche better than anyone before them. Because next time, we're going somewhere even Jung himself was afraid to look.